I think this is a great question, Jeff. He said, I haven't heard your all's opinion on the investigation and lawsuit. If I missed it, I apologize, but would really like to know your thoughts. So here's the one thing, and I think really the whole situation will boil down to this one thing. And court systems cannot allow this to be the case because then, well, I'll explain. The one thing that, and Chancellor Plowman mentioned this in her very straightforward letter that she wrote to the president of the NCAA. You cannot retroactively apply rules and regulations that were not in place at the time that these events happened. You can't make up these, new rules and say, "Oh, and we're going to retroactively apply them." You can't expect people to know what rules you're thinking about that you'll put in place months later at that time. That would be like me coming up with a rule for my kids, not telling them. Well, no, that's too kind actually. That would be like my kids doing something and then 7 months later I come up with a rule and I'm like, "Oh, you couldn't do that." So because you did it that one time that I never that and you had no idea that you couldn't do it. It wasn't I never said anything about it, but I'm going to retroactively apply punishment now because you did that 7 months ago. That's absurd. No halfway decent judge is going to look at that and say, "Yeah, that's okay." No, you have to have stuff in writing. You have to have the rules and regulations in writing so that every single team in the country knows this is what we can and what we cannot do. You can't say, "Oh, well, we're going to make this a rule now, and we're going to go back and retroactively apply this now and make everybody adhere to this, even though they had no clue about it when these things happen." Because, my goodness, okay, if they do that, then can we go back and change outcomes of entire seasons and take national championships away from teams if they did something 10 years ago that would now be considered not allowed? Can we go back and take away national championships from people and say that was they were ineligible for that because they broke the rules that we've now applied retroactively 10 years ago? Like, that is such a dangerous and slippery slope. There's no way any judge would allow that precedent to be set. It just wouldn't happen. So, in my opinion, that's the one thing that this is going to boil down to, and the one reason why Tennessee will not be penalized from this issue.
So I've got 4 points and an invitation. So this is going to be a long sermon.
Well, hang on. So Mina, like you said, bingo. She agreed with me. Go ahead.
So number one, we did not sue the NCAA. Virginia did. We joined their lawsuit. That suit was already in place because of the double transfer rule, and we joined their lawsuit. So actually, the Virginia Attorney General was first, and we piggybacked on theirs. The reason we piggybacked on theirs was the same reason that the Virginia Attorney General started the first lawsuit. All the violations are bogus. You can't go back and retroactively make up rules. You can't go back and say that you're going to pick and choose. Initially Tennessee, Florida, and Florida State were named. Okay, well, meanwhile, Georgia's quarterback is down in Athens actively saying that he wants $4 million or he's not coming back, publicly making that statement. Caleb Downs, like anybody who's around the Caleb Downs situation, and I am connected to his father, so I can attest this is firsthand knowledge. Caleb Downs was never going to Georgia. He was going to Ohio State from day one because they made a significantly better NIL offer. And Travaris Robinson leveraged the idea of Caleb coming with him to Georgia to get a job at Georgia. And now Georgia's pretty ticked off because they thought it was a package deal. And T-Rob basically lied to them to get a job because he knew that Kalen DeBoer wasn't going to keep him at Alabama. And, so you've got a whole tangled web there where not only do you have a kid going to another school because they made an offer of the most money, you got a coach lying about him being a deal to get a job. So, there's a whole mess of issues there. That's like tampering times 1,000. So that the fact that they're picking and choosing who they're going after is just the NCAA trying to flex a muscle that honestly they don't have. So the absolute best thing that happened in the last 2 weeks was Greg Sankey and Tony Batiti getting together as SEC and Big Ten and just saying, you know what, y'all suck at this, so we're just going to figure it out and tell y'all what to do. That was the absolute best meeting that possibly could have happened. And if the NCAA is smart before they go bankrupt and just drown and go under, they need to name Greg Sankey the president of the NCAA and let him run the show, because he's the only person in all this that has everybody's respect and who can right the ship before it sinks. So, the two people in the room, the two adults in the room that actually have a say are the commissioner of the Big Ten and the commissioner of the SEC. No one else matters. And they all know that. So, those two individuals just need to decide everything before this goes off a cliff. And then everybody else just needs to get on board with it, because whatever those two individuals say, it's going to end up being right. The absolute worst thing that can happen in all this, I saw 2 days ago, Tommy Tuberville has inserted himself back into this. There's two other members of Congress that have inserted themselves back into this. Sweet Jesus, do not allow any politicians to be involved in this process, because none of them have a freaking clue what they're talking about, and they're going to make this 1,000 times worse. The two people who need to decide are Greg Sankey and Tony Batiti, and everybody else just needs to say, yes, sir, and go along with whatever the two of them say. Tommy Tuberville was on a radio station about a month ago talking about a bill that he was trying to write to help with NIL. And he literally said on the air that there were members of the Senate who were in a negotiation about this bill who couldn't tell him how college athletics even work. Like they'd never watched a game. And they're in a meeting trying to come up with litigation about how they're going to manage NIL. It was insanity. And they're just going to make this 1,000 times worse. The last thing that I'll say, and Cole Kublik went off about this last week, but I agree with him 1,000%. This idea of collective bargaining that is coming down the pipe and is gaining some steam, and more schools are talking about it, that is the absolute worst thing that could possibly happen in college athletics. And if you want to destroy the NCAA tomorrow, come up with a collective bargaining agreement, because what's not going to happen. For those of you who don't know how collective bargaining works, there's an agreement with a union where every player gets a certain amount of money out of royalties and revenues. Well, what's not going to happen? Texas A&M, who has an annual athletic department revenue of $200 million, is not going to agree to share with Vanderbilt, because Vanderbilt's never going to contribute enough to the collective for it to make sense for anybody who actually cares about athletics. And so, we're going to have this massive divide of schools, and it's going to become a haves and have-nots thing, where all the schools that have massive revenue are going to be like, we're not sharing with UNC Asheville. It's crazy. And, the Michigans of the world are going to be like, we're not even fraternizing with those people. That's insane. We're not sharing our money with them. And so, what you're essentially going to do is you're going to destroy Group of 5 schools, 1AA. They'll all just stop playing because they won't be able to afford otherwise. And all the money will go to the top 40 schools, who will, do what they do, and everything will move forward just like it always has. And the smaller schools will all go by the wayside. So collective bargaining would be the absolute worst thing that could possibly happen. If you haven't seen it, this is how insane it's gotten. Tulsa, the University of Tulsa's football coach, they posted a video of him today in an interview, and he read a tweet or a text from a recruit.
Yeah.
Now, the content of the text was comical because it was just so ludicrous what this kid was asking this coach. But you have to pay attention to what he said. Okay. This is a Power Five kid who clearly wasn't very good because he's transferring to Tulsa. So he's lost his job in the Power Five and he's transferring to Tulsa. And in the text message, he said to the coach, I get $6,000 to $7,000 a month now, and I have 2 dogs and a girlfriend. What am I supposed to do? How much are you going to give me? Okay, well, separate out the 2 dogs and a girlfriend part because that was just dumb. A kid at a Power 5 school who hasn't been a contributor and hasn't done well and is having to take a step back to a group of 5 school just told that head coach that he makes $72,000 to $84,000 a year in NIL. $6,000 to $7,000 a month. The group of 5 coach is like, we can't pay him anything.
Right.
We don't have that kind of money. But to the kid, it was just a normal conversation. I'm making 70 grand right now. What are you going to give me? That's what everybody wants to avoid, is a collective bargaining agreement where that conversation becomes common. And
Yeah.
everybody's like, oh, if I go to this school, I'll get this much a year. If I go to this school, I'll get this much a year. Nobody wants that. And at the end of the day, there's only 2 people who can solve this and 2 people who can make sure none of that happens. And it's Greg Sankey and Tony Petitti. And everybody just needs to go with whatever those 2 men want to do.